America has had a huge win when it comes to accessibility earlier this month. There was a new update added to the American Disability Act, or the ADA, which will have a huge impact on making websites and apps accessible for those with disabilities more so than it did before. You see, the ADA laws were created in 1990. That was quite a while ago, and that was before internet and people using apps really existed. And so when it was first created, there wasn't really anything specific about protecting people using websites or applications. There is another set of laws that are the Section 508 laws, and the 508 laws follow what we call the WCAG or the WCAG guidelines, which have varying degrees of making sure that your websites and applications are accessible. Before I get any further, I want to point out I'm not a lawyer. I definitely don't understand lawyer jargon, but I have found some websites that explain it so I can better understand what I'm talking about, and I'm just going to show you key points and we're going to look at it together and try to understand it together. But don't take my word for it. I'll put links in the description to show you all of the research that I found, and you can do your own research to better understand the changes to the laws and already existing laws. I just wanted to make a video to bring awareness of the changes of the laws and prepare for the huge changes that will be coming with it. All right, the first website I'm going to show you is the website by the Office of Public Affairs, U.S. Department of Justice. This is a press release that was put out on April 8th, 2024. I'm going to go ahead and read some key points and then share my thoughts as we're going. Attorney General Merrick B. Garland today signed a final rule under the Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure the accessibility of web content and mobile applications for people with disabilities. This final rule clarifies the obligation of state and local governments to make their websites and mobile applications accessible. And then it continues to explain what type of entities this will affect. So it says everyday people across the country use the web and mobile apps to access public programs, services, including emergency information, courts, healthcare providers, schools, voting information, parking, permitting applications, tax statements, and transit updates. That includes so many things that people have to use all of the time, and I think it's wonderful that they're taking the next step to make it more accessible to more people and to really solidify that the government cares about making their stuff accessible for people with disabilities. Then it quotes, "This final rule marks the Justice Department's latest effort to ensure that no person is denied access to government services, programs, or activities because of their disability." That was said by Attorney Garland, and he continues to say, "By issuing clear and consistent accessibility standards for state and local governments' digital content, this rule advances the ADA's promise of equal participation in society for people with disabilities." So I think this is a great point of why I feel like this is really helpful for this to be added to the laws, because before the laws said that things need to be accessible, but it didn't really state how or what the expectation was when it had to be accessible. So when you're in court and you're fighting that something isn't accessible or it is accessible, it's going to be a lot easier and more concise if it has specific guidelines that need to be followed. And then that way it also ensures that it's accessible, and that instead of it just being in this gray area of people trying to figure out what they think should be accessible and what might not be considered accessible. Then further down, Assistant Attorney General states, "This rule is truly historic and long overdue, as it will help break down barriers that have kept people with disabilities from fully participating in American life." I love that they are admitting that there are barriers that have been in the way of people using things, and they're admitting that and they're doing something about it. At the bottom of the press release, it says that there's a fact sheet that explains basically what's going to be happening with this final rule. So let's go ahead and look at that and see how it will affect people. This is the meat of it, and it will actually tell us how it's going to affect the ADA laws. This link's also in the description, like any of the other links that I'm referring to. The purpose of this fact sheet is to give a summary of the rule. So at the top of this document, it explains why this law was made. We already covered that, so we're going to skip down to the highlights of the requirements in the rule. So this is not all of the rule, this is just a summary of it. So when that is released, then you can look more into the specific details, but this gives the general overall of what it's going to be. So it says the first requirement is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, version 2.1 level AA is a technical standard for state and local governments, web content, and mobile apps. So the existing guidelines are now being required in the ADA laws. So instead of it being just part of 508, it's part of the ADA laws now. The second requirement on here says that state and local governments web content usually needs to meet WCAG 2.1 level AA. So it shares an interesting example. It says if a county web page lists the addresses and hours of operation for all county parks, that web page must meet WCAG 2.1 level AA, even if a local web design company and updates it for the county. So it's clarifying that regardless of who designed it, whether it's someone who's hired by the government or not, it needs to meet these requirements. The next requirement is the same, where all mobile applications or apps need to meet WCAG 2.1 AA as well. All right, let's just look in general what the exceptions might be, and then you can look at the details of what requirements need to be met for each. So the first one is archived web content. The second one is pre-existing conventional electronic documents. The third is content posted by a third party where the third party is not posting due to contractual, licensing, or other arrangements with a public entity. 4 is individualized documents that are password protected. 5 is pre-existing social media posts. The next section talks about other information about complying with the rules. So let's look at these. Let's see, it says sometimes a state or local government tries to have 2 versions of the same web content or content and mobile app, one version that is not accessible and another that is, and provides all the same information and features. The second is called a conforming alternative version. Then it says usually state and local government should not have to have a main web page that is inaccessible and a separate accessible version of the same content, because people with disabilities should get equal access to the content of the same page. Next, it says under the rule, state and local governments may use conforming alternate versions as an alternative to inaccessible content only in very limited circumstances. Next, it proposes a question: what happens if a state or local government has failed to meet the WCAG 2.1 level AA in a minor way? The way they answer this question is, in some limited situations, state and local governments may be able to show that their web content or mobile apps do not meet WCAG 2.1 level AA in a way that is so minor that it would not change a person with a disability's access to the content or mobile app, if the state or local government can show that they are not violating the rule. I like this statement. Listen up. State and local governments cannot use this part of the rule to avoid trying to meet the guidelines. If a state or local government's web content does not meet WCAG 2.1 level AA, there are many things that the government would have to do to prove to show that they do not violate the rule. Okay, the last section, it talks about how long state and local governments have to comply with the rule. So obviously this is a big deal and it's going to affect a lot of people, and it's going to take time for this implementation to happen. So they're giving time for people to be able to meet these requirements, but once that time period is over, then you are at risk of being sued because your stuff is not legally following the laws that it needs to. So it's based on the size. So it says state or local government size. 0 to 49,99,000 people. That gives them 3 years after the final rule is published. Special district governments have 3 years after the final rule published. And 50,000 or more people in the government or the system, they have 2 years to comply. Oh, that was a lot of information. If anyone's still with me, wow, I applaud you. But I'm just super excited to learn more. This is still kind of something that I don't fully understand. I'm excited to read more about it and research it as I'm going. Now, something to clarify is this really only applies to state and federal governments, and it doesn't apply to businesses. So in the laws, it states that businesses need to be able to make their stuff accessible, but it's still vague. So I'm hoping that the next step in making the laws more clear is to help businesses understand what they need to do in order to meet the guidelines, in order to make their apps and their websites accessible. Now, while they don't have to meet technically the WCAG 2.1 guidelines level AA, that is an industry standard to make it meet that, because when they go in front of a judge and there's a case of is this accessible or not, and you meet those guidelines, then it's going to be pretty solid if you're already meeting these guidelines. So that is the suggestion, that even though technically it doesn't state that, that is your best bet, is meeting the WCAG guidelines when you're a business. But that is still a gray area right now, and I hope there's clarification in the laws in the upcoming years. I'd love to hear in the comments below what your thoughts and comments are on this topic. I'm excited about the idea that things will be required to be more publicly accessible, and that they're making a priority and making changes to these laws. I hope you all have a fantastic week, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!